Let's get started. Hi everyone. We're glad you're able to be with us here today as we have an important discussion on preventing caregiver burnout and compassion fatigue. My name is Maria Margaglione, and I'm the programs director here at DBSA. Joining me today is DBSA's program manager, Hannah Zeller, and therapist Beth Vaccaro. Beth is a St. Louis, she's the one who waved. Beth is a St. Louis native, attended Webster University and earned her master's degree in counseling. She did her postgraduate training at Care and Counseling and the St. Louis Psychoanalytic Institute. Currently, she is in private practice as a therapist in Clayton, Missouri. She sees adults and adolescents with a wide variety of issues and practices from a psychodynamic perspective. Thanks for being here with us today, Beth.
Thanks for having me. It's my pleasure, truly.
Okay, so today we're hoping our discussion will help us understand signs and symptoms of caregiver burnout and compassion fatigue, maybe some strategies that can be useful to protect us from developing or worsening symptoms of compassion fatigue, and different steps to take if you're feeling burnout and fatigue. So after our discussion, we'll open up the floor so that participants can ask questions. On the bottom of your screen, you'll see a little Q&A tab. If while we're speaking and you have a question, feel free to type it in, but we probably won't get to those questions until towards the end of the session. So let's get started. Beth, I think a natural place to start is, can you tell us what compassion fatigue and caregiver burnout are?
Absolutely. It's a really important subject. And as I have gathered information and become familiar with this, I realize just how important understanding this is for anybody in the caregiver profession, as well as anyone that is a caregiver to someone that's ill mentally or physically. Compassion fatigue and caregiver burnout are related, but they're not exactly the same thing. Compassion fatigue really originates in the emotional realm. It can come on quite suddenly, and it's a state of being. And what happens is that a caregiver feels very close to the trauma or the feelings of suffering, often gives a lot of compassion and empathy, and from that takes on a vicarious, or sometimes it was called a secondary trauma, and they can become preoccupied with the physical or mental suffering of the people that are in their care, and so they begin to sort of carry that around with them emotionally. Burnout, on the other hand, occurs over time, and it's much more pervasive. It affects all aspects of the person's environment. And so when we think about somebody getting burnt out in the workplace, it's, in many different facets of the workplace, they get to the point that they just get crispy. And so sometimes the recommendation is to leave that workplace and to start fresh. But if the workplace is in the home where they're doing the care, that's not an option. So really, caregiver burnout, the way that it can look is that somebody feels mentally, physically, and emotionally just drained, overwhelmed, and exhausted. So there's overlap for both of them, and in that they can impair and impact our judgment and our ability to function. So basically, that's kind of the definition. Those are some of the definitions, or how I'd like to define them.
Wow, just the comparison of, or comparing going to your job as your job being at home. And I think that thought alone can be, can introduce more burnout, can introduce more fatigue.
Absolutely, because there's no escape. When I close the door to my office, I'm finished with my patients. Now, if I carry that with me and I don't empty the vessel, that's on me. But I do leave this office building, and I do leave my role. And that is one of the pitfalls for people that are caregivers to family members or perhaps a friend. they're in the environment 100% of the time.
Yeah, well, hopefully, a little bit later in this discussion, we're gonna, we're gonna talk about maybe how we can get some, well, I am more than positive we will talk about boundaries. But before we go into that, what are some signs and symptoms? How would someone know?
So there are in several different categories, we tend to see some signs and symptoms in emotional categories, in our cognitive or our thinking, and in physical categories. So emotionally, if somebody is in a caregiver role and they begin feeling more anger than they typically do, or they're very, very sad, or they have heightened irritability. Sometimes they might be shut down from their emotions, and sometimes those emotions might explode. That's going to clue us into some emotional wear and tear. Sometimes people can become apathetic and unempathetic, like they run out of empathy. They can feel emotionally exhausted, like you've gone to CrossFit for your mind, and you're just, there's no gas in that tank. And then feelings of hopelessness and helplessness. Now, in terms of like our thoughts and our cognitions, one clue might be if you are dwelling on the suffering or the troubles of the person that's in your charge. If you start blaming yourself for the other person's situation, if you feel like your efforts are not effective anymore, if you're having difficulty making decisions or concentrating on the things that you need to tend to in your life, if you lose joy and interest in things that you once found pleasurable. I know I'm in bad shape if I don't want to go pull weeds and plant flowers, for example. That is a real clue that something's up for me. Now, some of us might feel more physical symptoms. Our bodies tend to talk. Especially if we're not talking, our bodies talk. So if you have stomach issues that start to pop up, like you're feeling nauseous, you don't feel like you want to eat, you have stomach cramps, or you might feel dizzy, lightheaded, heart palpitations, a lot of muscle tension, that might clue us in that something's going on. And if you start turning to substances to help you cope, that can be a clue. Additionally, relational conflicts and just a reduced sense of meaning in the world, those are all clues that something might be going on in the compassion fatigue or caregiver burnout department.
Pretty much everything you said were symptoms of depression. So
Yeah.
all the symptoms, it's very similar, and that's where that emotional component comes in. But yeah, it's amazing. I don't know if there's some type of transference or what people believe on that. When you have so much empathy, you take on other people's emotions, and that being a way, well, it leads to emotional pain.
It leads to a lot of emotional pain, and there have been many studies about caregivers, especially like that are in requiring to take care of someone physically, that oftentimes that they neglect any of these symptoms and they become ill themselves. And part of my gathering of information, I came to understand that happens mentally for people that take care of people that struggle with mental health issues, is that caregiver burnout can go into depression. It can go into an anxiety disorder. And that's, I think, one of the reasons why this is so important to talk about today, is that hopefully we can help catch that before it happens, before the caregiver goes down that dark hole.
Yeah, I'm really appreciative that you laid it out. We can feel both these emotional symptoms. We can also feel some physical cues as well. I'm wondering if in your research and in your understanding, so folks can be tuned in, is there a symptom we might notice earlier? Because I feel like, a lot of times when we're getting to that place of burnout, that place of fatigue, it feels like it's too late. So are there ways in which we can cue into some of these things earlier before they happen? Do you think it's it's physical symptoms first and then emotional symptoms, or is it going to be a little different for everybody?
I think the fatigue might be one of the first symptoms. That if you notice that you're more tired, to sort of like check in to see, is that as a result of something physical, or is that a result of, more of an emotional strain? That's some of our first clues, I would say, before things get more profound.
Awesome. Thanks.
And just jumping back to a survey we did a few years ago showed that, Hannah, was it 2/3 of participants
Yeah.
who they are, those who are our caregivers also live with, 2/3 of them live with a mental health condition, either specifically depression or bipolar. So I guess what, there's so many different pieces that affect that. And that actually leads to the next question is, what are contributing factors that cause caregiver burnout and compassion fatigue?
Absolutely. I think that I wanted to say, just to speak to Hannah's question, if you realize that you're too full, also, if you feel that feeling of being too full, that is a signal that you need to learn how to or empty your vessel. So if you're noticing that you're too full a lot of the time, that's probably another, along with fatigue, of the first signals that, if I know I can't handle, to even sit down and to watch a dramatic story, I know that I have heard and processed and thought about plenty for the day, and that I need to empty the vessel before I can take on anything else, like even the news sometimes, quite honestly.
Yeah, our own focus can really be a huge, I know when I'm too stressed, I can't read as well. So thank you for bringing that up. The focus piece can be a good indicator, sure.
But the mind and the emotional mind are muscles too, and they can get fatigued. So that's just realistic. Okay, so you mentioned your question about what are some of the causes of burnout. So I wanted to speak to that, Maria. So first of all, how heavy is the workload? A really heavy workload for a caregiver requires time, attention, and energy. And depending on how much is being put in, that is a contributing factor to these conditions that we've been talking about today. Having unrealistic expectations about your role as a caregiver, about what you're responsible for, how much you can help the person that's in your care, putting it on yourself as the caregiver for them to get better, for them to heal, can contribute to compassion fatigue and burnout. Feeling various levels of lack of control, and that can come in the form of not having enough resources, not having enough money for respite care, not feeling like you have the choices over other people's decisions. So, for example, and that might be that a parent may have a child that has turned 18 and has decided to go off their medication, and feeling that lack of control can contribute, and can lead to, lack of control can lead to the caregiver trying to take on more to manage that lack of control. Having unreasonable demands on themselves, that kind of goes back to the unrealistic expectations, but that they can just push a little harder or do a little bit more. And this might be coming from the self, but also coming from other people. And then we talked about, parents not being able to take the hat off of as caregiver when they are done with their workday. So having role confusion, just not having, days bleed into nights, bleed into days where they never get a break. Oftentimes caregivers are the people among us that can be somewhat perfectionistic. And so having the bar set so high always leads to disappointment. I certainly see this in my office all the time, in various forms of perfectionism, where they don't ever enjoy the goodies of their efforts, because as soon as they make it here, then the bar is set here, then the bar is set here. But it's like, but what about all this good stuff? Let's enjoy the good that you put into the world. And then, of course, unspoken or neglected feelings. So if we're stuffing our feelings, if we're not even attuned to them, that can result in a burnout.
So I'm laughing at the, what about this? What all the good things? And because I have that perfectionist, I'm like, but what about this? What about all the bad things I didn't get to? So there's trying to find that middle spot. And yeah, I had a coach who said, no, I just 11 seconds, let yourself realize this good thing that happened or you did or something.
I love that.
Yeah.
I love that. 11 seconds.
Yeah, I don't know why 11 seconds is the magic number, but point obviously being to just sit and allow that to happen for a second, because otherwise that perfectionistic, I don't know, maybe you can speak to that a little bit more, because that sort of runs through a lot of different conditions. Do you have any thoughts about, are there other 11-second tools to use that you want to talk about a little bit?
Well, I think that the most important thing to understand about perfectionism perhaps is that oftentimes we think of like this perfect spot as being the only safe place. So if my paper is perfect, if my presentation here today is perfect, then I'm not open for shame. I'm not open for any kind of ridicule or criticism. And so there is this imaginary perfect where people imagine that they can get to, lots of imagining, and instead of tolerating our imperfections here, which is what, we're all human. I'm going to stumble over my words today. I might not know the answer to a question, but I've given forth a worthy effort and I mean it. And so I'm going to try to enjoy this down here. Being a psychodynamic therapist, I don't have a lot of tools and tricks, but I tend to go toward the understanding, the understanding of why somebody wants to be here. And it oftentimes, I would say, is then I don't have to feel ashamed. I don't have to feel bad or fallible, and it is so painful. And so unfortunately, it's tolerating those really, really hard feelings that make us all human.
Yes. Well, and Brene Brown wasn't the first to say it, but that, if you can't feel shame, you can't feel joy. If you can't feel one thing, this challenging emotion, you can't feel this wonderful elation or anything else, because this block has happened, and this imaginary place. I love the talk about safety, feeling safe. So thank you. I didn't mean to take us down that rabbit hole, but it's so important. And I know it's a part of compassion fatigue and burnout. So
can I ask a follow-up here too?
Yeah.
I'm just curious too, a lot of times we want to be perfectionists. We want things to go the right way. And I think, I'm wondering, either anecdotally or just in things you've read, if it feels even more intense when a parent or caregiver, they're a caregiver, right? So they're trying to do this for someone that they love. They're trying to do something for, someone that they care about. But, our relationships are a two-way street. So I'm wondering, if sometimes, if there's like a boundary thing here, like setting our own expectations, but those might not be the expectations of those that we're caring for. And if there's anything that we might be just setting ourselves up to be perfectionists in how we're caring for others, but we might not even be caring for ourselves that well.
I think that absolutely. And when we get into talking about some of the things that we can do to sort of remedy this, I think boundaries go across the board. And so thinking about, what is a realistic expectation? Can I be with my child 24 hours a day, 7 days a week without any break? Is that realistic? Is it realistic for me to take on managing my 17-year-old child's medication? Or is that something that I could give to my child who needs to learn how to take care of himself a little bit better? I think it gets into trickier territory when, there's a certain level of risk involved. And certainly I have sat with many parents who have children that are troubled, suicidal, not functioning, and then the anxiety goes up. And then I think that over functioning can happen on the part of the parent because, of course, they don't want to lose their child. There's an emergency there. But even there can be some boundary setting and realistic sort of challenging of emotions and distortions that present themselves in those sorts of situations that, that we can't prevent someone from harming themselves if they really want to harm themselves. And that's really hard to digest, especially when it's our child. That there is a limit to what we can do. Hannah, I hope I answered your question a little bit.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay. Is it all right if I talk about some of the risk factors for caregiver burnout?
Yeah.
Would that be all right? Okay. So a couple of things to think about would be the level of exertion, whether that's mental, physical, or emotional. Like, what are the challenges that you're having to put into caring for your child or your person that needs care? And then we just talked about a minute ago the severity of the problems of the care recipient. So if the person is, seriously mentally ill, has been hospitalized a number of times, is suicidal, is non-functioning, that's a much more engrossed situation and in difficult situation for the caregiver and wears on that person. And then this is kind of a bridge, I think, into our remedies that if we have poor or neglected self-care, that's a contributing factor because we're not doing anything to offset all of this care that we're putting out for somebody else. Again, socioeconomic issues, not having enough money or not having access to resources contributes to burnout. How long the illness has been a part of the individual's life and the caregiver's life, if there's a lack of a support system, and then if there's any kind of substance abuse, all of those contribute to caregiver burnout. And I know a lot of people during the pandemic, there's been a lot of evidence that there's increased substance use. And I can anecdotally say that in my practice, certainly a lot more drinking going on since COVID began.
Yeah, well, which kind of leads straight into the what are some coping strategies?
Yeah. The happier stuff. How do we offset the tipping of the scale? Right?
Well, I mean, but drinking is a coping strategy, so what are some, I mean, just honestly, but what are ones that are going to help drain some of the stress or the what other taking care of someone else, what that's causing? What are some?
Sure. So the very first thing is awareness. And so anybody that's listening to this is curious if they might have experienced or might be experiencing compassion fatigue or caregiver burnout. So just getting those neurons firing and being curious about how's our mind working, how's our body working, sort of assessing, how am I feeling? We have to, take a moment to just examine our situation and slow down enough to be able to do that. And then we need to strike a balance. So we've talked a lot about when things are offset, how can we find the balance on the scale again? And the very first thing I think that is really important for this is giving permission for self-care, which is not an easy thing for caregivers or those of us that have perfectionistic tendencies. Self-care tends to fall way down on the list, but that is the antidote to an awful lot of stuff. So in the terms of self-care, we're going to look at balancing the physical, the emotional, and the spiritual. And so those physical components, like, are you getting enough sleep? Do you have a good sleep hygiene practice? Are you eating healthfully? Are you eating enough? Are you eating too many sweets? Can you have more fruits and veggies in your diet? I mean, it sounds sort of rudimentary, but we humans, we're animals, and you don't sleep enough, you don't eat right, and pretty soon you're pretty much out of whack, like a washing machine that's overloaded with a giant comforter, and you're banging back and forth. Getting your regular checkups. So if you're noticing like those physical symptoms like nausea or headaches, first and foremost, go get yourself checked out, get your blood work done, get your blood pressure, know where you are physically, and then exercise. And I'm a big proponent of doing exercise that doesn't feel like exercise. So what's something that you might enjoy doing that, isn't going to be, an added task on your list? I like to dance. So, and Maria, I know you said before we got started that you also like to dance. So, that's exercise. That's moving your body. That's getting your blood flowing. All that's good stuff. And then to tend to the emotional part of ourselves in terms of self-care. Can we confide in someone else, or are you holding all of this inside? Who can you process feelings with? I mean, if people are watching this, I'm glad that they are aware of your website. You have some wonderful tools available to help caregivers and people that have depression or bipolar illness. Do you have a support system? Who can you talk to? Who can take a turn? And how do you challenge some of those negative thoughts that you might not be right? Perfect might not be where you need to be. And then in the spiritual realm, connecting to something just outside of your own life. Sometimes we can get so narrowly focused that we forget there's a whole big world out there. There are clouds and birds and other things, including other people that might relate to our struggles. And then sort of across the board, I'll just say it again because it's just important that to set boundaries for our physical and our emotional and our spiritual well-being. We need to know where we stop and the other person starts. And those boundaries need to be practiced. And it's challenging, especially with a child that's not well in any way, especially for some of us that fall in caregiver roles, that we have not been conditioned to put ourselves on the list. And boundaries, it is about valuing the self, caring for the self. And then finally, connecting the dots to figure out, who do you need to connect with? Is it your primary care doctor? Is it a support person? Is it a therapist like me to talk through some things? The power of putting things from our mind and our heart into words is outstanding. Do you have friends that you can confide in? Can you ask for a day off? Can you find a webinar that might help you?
Seems like some people are in the right place already. Can I ask, I think all those strategies are really awesome. And I think, some of them more intuitive than others, but But I'm wondering, for the parent or caregiver who's at that place of, okay, I'm really, really stressed. How do I even start setting boundaries? How do I even start? I think a lot of times we hear self-care and we roll our eyes because it's
Yeah.
like, okay, but when is the time? But how do we begin to start, taking some small steps to try to reframe that within ourselves? Do you have any suggestions or
So I think we have to have the permission inside of ourselves to take the time to evaluate it. And I believe when we talked last year, we talked about the sort of the spectrum of between selfless and selfish. And in the middle of that is self. So, practicing self care is not selfish and it's not selfless. If you're selfless, yourself is missing. If you're selfish, you're not thinking about anybody else. In the middle is self. And so, one of the selling points, I think, just like when they talk about, on an airplane, you can't help anybody else if you don't help yourself. I think sometimes that can maybe put a cog in the wheel a little bit to realize that I'm not being effective if I don't take care of myself. That actually isn't good. And I'm also potentially teaching my kids that that this is the way to best go about things and to not put yourself on the list. And I think it maybe starts, with action that is just simple, like taking a walk when you're feeling full, starting to notice the fatigue, notice the exhaustion, taking that moment to think about, how do I feel about this day? Where can I have some help? What doesn't feel good? When people cross boundaries, it doesn't feel good. So that might be a clue in that some boundary setting might need to happen. But it ultimately starts with the person being important enough to themselves to take some of these steps. And if you can't do that, maybe working with a therapist might be quite helpful to see if you can unlock that space inside of you that can value the self enough to pursue some care.
Well, and again, aligning the symptoms with say depression, that hopelessness. Hannah mentioned when someone says self-care, we roll our eyes because that's not going to work. I don't have time for that. And it's that happens with people who live with depression. Well, I'm not going to go to therapy because it's not going to make a difference. Talking about my problems is not going to help. Talking to someone else who has the same problems isn't going to help. But we have figured out that it does help. And so, but getting to that spot, I remember I live with a mental health condition and I've also been in the caregiver place. And one of my therapists said, what do you get out of trying to take control of your partner's, trying to fix him or trying to make sure that he's taking care of himself. And I'm like, what do you mean? I'm not getting anything out of it. And he's like, well, actually you are. And I'm like, oh, well, I don't have to look at myself then. And because that's harder. It's easier to see it in somebody else. But when someone holds that mirror up, that's not to make anybody feel bad. It's just getting caught up in that thing. Again, going back to being human. So so important to remember. For some reason, I have not thought so much about this parallel between depression and even though I know the symptoms very well of depression, not just from our website or working here, but from having it. So those are all very good points. I think I know we have some questions coming in. And Hannah, do you have one that you think might be good to start off with?
I think there's a lot of comments that I can go through, but let me just double check. Yeah, so folks, if you have questions, start populating them in the chat. We'll get to that Q&A. Some people have left some great comments, so I'll go through them now as you guys ask some questions. Angela, thank you for your suggestion. Dealing with anxiety, the Recovery International Method teaches cognitive behavioral tools to help relieve symptoms. Among other things, it has tools to lower your expectations and feelings will rise, and to drop the perfectionism and lower our standards and think of yourself and the situation as average, and expectations can lead to disappointment. I use this method when caregiving with my mother with Alzheimer's. Angela, recoveryinternational.org. Thanks for sharing that. I think that's really,
very
really
helpful.
And they have peer-led meetings as well. So awesome. Thanks for that.
Which we'd be remiss not to mention DBSA's parent or friends and family support groups. We have online and in person for those who are doing in person now. But yes, that peer support, it really does help.
Yeah, great. All right, we have some questions coming in, so I want to get to those. Okay, my husband is the caregiver of me and has traditionally cared for our now 19-year-old son, and I am in a place of being a mentor to my son. My husband and I are at a crossroads in caregiving. I want to make sure he cares for himself. How can I support him as our roles change?
How interesting that we're giving a question from a care recipient, and I hear the appreciation in her question. And I think giving him that permission and encouragement to take care of himself, and letting him know that Angela, is that her name?
This is from Dasha.
From Dasha, that Dasha is ready to take care of herself a little bit more and be the mentor of her son. So giving him that permission, and to know that there might be some growing pains as things shift, would be my suggestion. Yeah,
that that role shift is very, has to be very intentional and spoken, I would think, spoken about, and so that there's an awareness, again, taking on different roles, whether you're the caregiver or not. I think that also points to something we were just speaking about, that role modeling. So being able to take care of yourself allows someone else to see that. It gives them, when you give yourself permission to take care of yourself, that other person feels permission then, and they can see how you're doing it. And I don't know, I just think that's so important, whether it's with a partner or with a, child.
Most definitely.
Yeah.
For sure. This is, I think similar to Dasha's question, but, as a peer, how do you help your caregivers avoid burnout and fatigue? And I think it's, pretty much what we just covered, but do you have any additional thoughts there?
Maybe, going back to the boundary setting, to see, what, as the care recipient, what are things that you can actually do for yourself? Where can you manage things so it doesn't fall in the caregiver's role, and to also respect their boundaries and encourage them to have boundaries, and to begin to think about themselves and their own care. I think the encouragement and the reassurance that that the care recipient will be all right probably gives quite a lot of permission. It's okay, Mom, if you go take a walk. Yeah. I'll be fine this weekend. I'm feeling all right. Can I help you with the dishes? Those sorts of simple things that, if you look at the stress list, it's all the little stresses that, really exhaust us in life. And so helping out as much as possible, doing what you can, that encourages the caregiver to, have a little bit more time for themselves.
Absolutely.
Well, and that's making me think of, and I'm not a mother, so I don't know this. I only know this from movies and stories and talking to other mothers when their children are growing up and they're starting to be more autonomous and starting to separate a little bit. There's that again, that changing role of, oh, I'm not going to have to do this for you anymore. Now what do I do? You know,
Mm-hmm.
that empty nest syndrome, I think can be very similar to this. You know, when someone is in recovery and they're starting to do well and they can take care of themselves and they don't need a caregiver so much, what happens to the caregiver? And, you know, again, just having an awareness of, you know, what am I feeling right now? What is, well, I feel a loss in a little way. And it's, you know, that cognitive dissonance of, well, I should be happy that I have more time, or, you know, but it doesn't. We get these grooves, you know, we get in these grooves, and for something else to stop that, no matter what it is, feels like just like our bumping our heads against a wall a little bit until we
And
understand it.
it can be completely mixed feelings too, that we can recognize, you know, that there's some relief, that the care recipient is getting better, and we can also feel that loss. Like, you can hold both of those mixed feelings, you know, which can, I think, be quite confusing to people, that, you know, shouldn't I just be happy? But, you know, that it can also involve loss of identity. You know, I'm the caregiver. And when you were talking about, you know, what's the payoff for you, you know, one of the payoffs is not having to look at our own stuff. Another one of the payoffs is that it feels good to help people. And that's, you know, oftentimes caregivers are in that role throughout their life. And so, you know, to not have that can feel like an identity crisis.
Yeah, that even resentment can come up when
Yes.
someone, oh, you don't need me now? Is that right?
Exactly.
You know, I'm speaking from experience here.
We have another question in the chat I want to be sure we get to. We have time for it. What would you suggest when my daughter, who is 14, father, we are divorced, does not believe that my daughter has a mood disorder, even though she has been diagnosed? We haven't seen each other, and he won't reach out. He lives very close, and our son still goes to his dad's house. He won't get involved, and he won't go to any doctor appointment. He has really put everything on this attendee and the daughter. So not validating that the daughter is actually diagnosed with the mood disorder and not being supportive. So this seems like a question of co-parenting too, which I know can be challenging.
Yeah, absolutely. Very, very challenging. And sometimes the issues between the parents get sort of acted out through the child. So, you know, I would encourage this parent to invite the father to the psychiatrist appointment or therapy appointment, to be a part of that. I'm going to assume that has already happened. And so the father's still denying the fact. So, you know, I feel very much for this parent who is struggling, because then it does all fall onto her. My focus would be on the child too, to make sure that that's processed with her therapist, his or her therapist, and you know, to just have an open conversation about what that feels like to have dad not believe, because it can be so challenging to get help and to try to heal, but especially if, you know, you feel like somebody is holding you back in that way, because it can be very shaming. I would encourage the parent that gave this question to take good care, and to think about it. Are there ways that she can get support from other places? Because it doesn't sound like the father is going to be participating, and to have the space to work through those feelings, because it's really difficult to have a kid that's struggling And then to not have the support of the co-parent makes it doubly hard. So I feel for her quite sincerely.
Yeah, I think sickness brings out that saying, it takes a village. We can't do everything alone. And I think one thing that I want to be sure to say is, again, back to that helplessness of, there are people willing to help, and you just have to ask. They may not understand how much help you need in this. We have time for just one more question, and the next question under there was someone who says they're afraid to leave their child alone because meds aren't correct yet, and there are a lot of mood swings. And so, I'm scared if I leave her alone. And are there other trusted adults that can help with this, especially until the meds are correct, and knowing people who know the next steps, if there's danger, calling 911, if this, if she does hurt herself, etc. So I guess, do you have any other thoughts on that, Hannah or Beth?
I guess I'm just feeling, the gravity of, how many obstacles there can be, and how many scary situations there are, and to just say them out loud and to ask these questions. Certainly this is somebody that needs support. There's no way to do that by yourself. And, holding that in, causes tremendous turmoil for the caregiver. I hope that they do have trusted people. I hope that perhaps they would join a support group and get ideas also from other parents that might, it's a common problem. I don't want to leave my child alone. I'm worried they're going to harm themselves. Well, yeah, that would be a very desperate feeling.
We just have a couple minutes, and I first of all, want to thank you, Beth, for being here with us today. For those of you on here, Beth did an article about caregiver burnout in our last newsletter that went out. She also helped us last year with social wellness. But seeing that we have so many people with teens and older children, Hannah, do you want to talk about the young adult session?
Yeah. And actually, there's a question we didn't get to in the chat about boundaries. And our next session, well, actually at 3 p.m. Central today, the Young Adult Council is going to have a session about transition ages. So kids that are 18 and over, and all those transitions from, college and schools. And so they're talking a lot about boundary setting from the peer perspective. So that might be helpful to you all as well. So we'll hope to see you there. But Beth, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today. I always, sitting in the room with the therapist for an hour, I always come out feeling a little more like fresh and clear. And I did that when we recorded our Wellness Wheel podcast about social wellness, which folks can check out too. But thank you so much. This was great.
Thanks for having me. Truly my pleasure.